My name's Mark Rawson. I'm the Managing Director and Principal Consultant at Rawtec. And for those of you that don't know us, we're a waste and resource recovery consultancy based in South Australia, but we are fortunate to work around the country. So our webinar series, which this is number 2 in our webinar series, we're trying to do these every fortnight or so, and bringing together experts and innovative thinkers to share some of their insights in their little patch. Again, particularly due to this time where we're not all as connected as we have been, and this is a good way to share what people are up to, and we'll hear about what Victoria's up to, which is making some large steps in their recycling sector, which is really exciting, I think. So the topic for today, you would have seen the brief. This is very much to hear about Recycling Victoria and some key aspects of that initiatives. It's not something that we won't be able to delve into all of it, but hopefully we'll be able to cover off on a few of the key areas. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Matt Genever, Director of Resource Recovery at Sustainability Victoria. Matt leads the integration of SV's statewide waste strategies and programs to deliver infrastructure and markets for Victoria's growing waste and resource recovery industry. You spent, Matt, more than 15 years working across waste and resource recovery in government, industry and not-for-profits. A recognised leader, absolutely a recognised leader. Matt's always a really good, from my perspective, a really good thinker. Also got a sense of humour, which helps in our sector, particularly at the moment. Yeah, absolutely. Matt's certainly someone good to hear from today. So Matt, I'm going to hand over to you, and perhaps even if I've missed anything in the intro on yourself, please fill it in, and maybe Sustainability Victoria, if you could just, for those that don't know, most people would know, but for those that don't know, a little bit about Sustainability Victoria. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you for hosting me. You're absolutely right. It's sort of uncharted territory that we're all in now, and it's particularly tough, I think, for a sector like ours where we're used to being out and about. We're used to doing site visits and lots of face-to-faces, and everybody in this sector loves a good conference. There's more conferences than you can swing a cat at. So this kind of ISO thing's not that much fun for all of us. So I really appreciate the work Rawtec's doing and trying to keep us all connected and keeping the conversation going. So thank you. 15 years is probably more like 20 years now, and I think the lack of hair on top sort of starting to speak to that. My daughter reminded me that I'm only 42 the other day, and it's the first time anyone had used only and 42 in the same sentence as me. So, but yeah, look, Sustainability Victoria is a statutory agency of the VicGov. We've been around since about 2005. We have our own act, the SV Act of 2005, and our remit is really to promote environmental sustainability in the use of resources, which is pretty broad. We have a board that's appointed by the Minister for Environment, and sort of within that remit, there's a whole stack we can do. But the one thing we must do is plan and maintain for Victoria's 30-year waste and resource recovery infrastructure plan. And really, I think in a nutshell, we deliver programs. Yeah, so we've got a department, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, that sets policy. We've got a great regulator, an EPA Victoria, and essentially we get to do the on-ground delivery around infrastructure, market development, behaviour change, all those, the fun job, as I like to call it.
Yeah, good, excellent. So. You obviously got a lot of tools at your disposal, and you're obviously about to unleash some of those tools or work with industry in that space. So Vic and the rest of Australia has faced a lot of challenges in the past few years around, particularly around recycling. And China soared, and then Vic obviously had that financial collapse of one of its larger recyclers. And that the ripple effect of that was significant through Victoria. Sort of what lessons have sort of come from that that are probably feeding into Recycling Victoria, the new initiative.
Yeah, really good question. And I think apart from, dramatic increase of hair loss over the last couple of years, I think, yeah, it's certainly been a tough ride. And as you say, Mark, that's not unique to Victoria. I think
No.
it's been a tough ride for our sector more broadly. Certainly agree that Victoria's probably been a bit more exposed. I mean, traditionally we've been an export hub for the sector, not just from material in Victoria, but from the southeast corner of our great country. And I think certainly when the export restrictions started to come into force from China and other Southeast Asian nations, it impacted us pretty quickly and pretty significantly. And I think the other thing there, Mark, is sort of around that market consolidation piece. As you mentioned, we had one curbside recycler that had about 50%, more than 50% of the market share, and ultimately ended up falling over, which sort of hasn't helped us in terms of getting that sort of diversity of markets that we want. And I think in terms of lessons learnt, that really hasn't changed for me. And I think I've spoken about this previously. There's not one single trigger here. Yeah, there's not one thing that's sort of led to the troubles that we've got. These are system-wide issues that sort of coalesce around this idea of a shared responsibility, this sort of acknowledgement that we all need to do more. Certainly the state government has got plenty to do in terms of supporting and regulating the sector. It's great to see the federal government, after sort of largely being sort of absent for the last 10 years, coming back into play, which is good. Local government certainly has some work to do around sort of better transparency and better consistency in service provision, which is really important. And ultimately, every single Australian has a role to play. Like you, Mark, I speak to a lot of people around the country, and you hear from MRFs that have got contamination rates of above 40%, and that is just completely untenable. That idea of you put shit in, you get shit out, and it doesn't matter what sort of reforms you put in. From an infrastructure point of view, that part of Australians doing their part is equally important. So I think in terms of the lessons learned, Mark, it's just solidified that for me that that this is a multifaceted system with a whole stack of kind of intervention points, and they're all equally important. And I certainly hope that those that have read Recycling Victoria can see that all of those touch points are kind of targeted within the new policy.
Absolutely, it's the policy covers a large range of areas and fairly ambitious, which is great. Yeah, that's what it should be. So talking about that and ambition, what sort of the vision, the overall vision for transforming resource recovery in Victoria? Because I think others will be looking closely at what you're planning to do and how you're planning to do it as well. So. It'll be useful for a range of jurisdictions, I think.
Yeah, look, I think we set out the vision pretty clearly in 2018. To be honest, when we sort of started really getting into the thick of green sort and some of the issues, we released the Recycling Industry Strategic Plan, which was kind of our first foray as a lead up into the policy. And I think if you look back on that document, it really coalesces around this idea of building a resilient recycling sector. Yeah, it spoke about the importance of higher quality materials coming in and out of the sector. It spoke about the importance of new infrastructure. It spoke at length about the importance of strong domestic markets, backed up by government procurement, and about sustained and consistent engagement with the community and behaviour change. So I think they're the fundamental things that really set out the vision for Victoria. And again, now that sort of Recycling Victoria is out and about, which is the first sort of statewide waste and resource recovery policy we've had probably since about 2015. I think it really takes those fundamental ideas of a resilient and reliable sector to the next level. And there's obviously a much more sort of comprehensive plan.
Yeah, those fundamentals don't really change, do they? So in terms of having strong markets for the products to go into and developing that demand over time, and obviously having systems that feed that those fundamentals aren't changing. It's just probably bringing them more into focus. And I think from my perspective, Victoria has been very strong in that market development, market demand, which is still critically important to this, and it probably more so now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And when we talk, I think other people are starting to talk about domestic resilience and not relying on China to do a whole heap of things like making medical masks and other bits and pieces. It's not dissimilar for our sector. In terms of where would you say that Victoria's current sort of strengths lie in waste and resource recovery? Where's sort of your current sort of strong areas?
Look, I think you've touched on that, Mark. For me, I mean, there's a lot. I think if you look at the sector more broadly, those kind of strengths around, energetic, entrepreneurial people, people that are willing to give it a go, that sort of innovative spirit. I think we share that with the rest of the country. But I think specific to us, one of the areas I'm really proud of is our work around market development and sort of taking recycled products from their infancy, that early sort of stage thinking, and all the way through the design, performance testing, standards and specifications, and then ultimately out into the big wide world, backed up by government procurement. I think that's an area that we've focused on pretty heavily over the last 10 years and is starting to pay dividends. I'd love to say it's an overnight transition, but it's been a long journey. But I think to see us at the point where we're sort of reprocessing the better part of 150,000 tonnes a year of recycled glass sand straight into VicGov big build projects, not to mention a couple of million tonnes of C&D waste and some pretty innovative new plastic products starting to hit the market. I think that gives us a springboard around that sort of idea of domestic sustainable markets to a new level, and I think I'm certainly very excited that that's a key part of the policy that SV will be delivering. It's one of the things that certainly drives me, and I think other areas, like we've always been a hub of plastics recycling. I'd love to see that grow. We've got a big packet of investment out there at the moment through the Recycling Victoria Infrastructure Fund, which targets things like plastic recycling, and a couple of those investments like the Advanced Circular Polymers Facility that's sort of been up and running now for 6 or 8 months, and some of the investments that some of our large FMCG companies are looking at in the plastic space. Again, I think will position Victoria really, really well.
Absolutely, and as I said before, from my perspective, looking at it sort of independently, Victoria and Victoria's state government, while there's no easy quick wins, pushing that procurement into state government is fundamental certainly from my perspective to get material consumed, and it shows leadership. But it's not easy, and it tends not to be done overnight. A lot of us sit there going, why can't this just be done tomorrow? But it is a long road, but Victoria seems to be keeping on pushing down that track hard, and certainly I think that's to be commended, and other jurisdictions can benefit from your lessons and what you've achieved in that sector.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think it's probably worth just clarifying that. So obviously Recycling Victoria is the big, whole of government circular economy recycling policy for Victoria, but it's supported by a wonderful mechanism called Recycled First, which is a policy that's largely going to be delivered out of the Department of Transport, which essentially positions recycled content at the forefront of sort of that whole infrastructure building phase. So rather than sort of the afterthought once a tender's been out and come back, it's forefront in the decision making as we move forward. And that Recycled First policy, again, as you said, I think that's going to be the catalyst, because agencies like SV, there's our contemporaries around Australia are doing the same work as us, trying to do our best to open up these markets. But I think a big ambitious step forward like the Recycled First policy is massive, and I think something that I hope other states will look to emulate.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fundamental pillar for success and developing the markets, particularly with some of these more challenging materials like you mentioned, glass and plastics. So just sort of thinking, where do you think the biggest challenges in transforming Victoria's waste and recycling sector might be? Where do you sort of foresee that? And there's multiple challenges on multiple fronts at the moment, as we know, but where can you identify where some of the challenges will be?
Yeah, it's an amazingly complex question to
It is.
answer, really, and I think it changes. It changes regularly. I mean, you'd be kind of hard placed not to put COVID-19 well and truly within that basket at the moment. Things are pretty tough at the moment, depending on what part of the market you're in.
Yep.
But outside that, again, I don't think we're necessarily unique here. I think the
No.
biggest challenge for us is living up to the sector's potential. I mean,
Yep.
it's kind of like you said before, Mark, those interventions, the pathway forward here is not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward. We've got huge resource demand. We've got increasing amounts of those resources coming to the end of their life. We need new technologies. We need new jobs. We need new skills. We've got a manufacturing sector that's ready to be plugged into. So it's kind of, how do we realize this potential that many people like you and I have sort of been desperately trying to highlight for the last decade or so. So I think the challenge for us is like everybody else, is bringing it all together, is getting all of those interventions, all the way from the market-led signals around the landfill levy and regulation, all the way up through sort of the industry development lens, and equally talking to 2.2 million Victorian households about how they best engage with the recycling sector and essentially do the right thing. So I think it's, rather than one single challenge, I think it's the culmination of that potential that we've always known is there, and just really hoping that we can realise that potential.
Yeah, I agree. As you say, the opportunity is there, but before us, and some of these things aren't particularly new, but it's about bringing them together, and as you mentioned, getting changing the behaviour of 2.2 million households is probably one of the fundamental ones.
Why won't they just do what they're told, Mark?
No. It must be an Australian thing. We don't like doing what we're told or
That's
something.
True. That is true.
So, but that's okay. We can help people. We can help people do that. And we'll talk about that. One of the things I think is a little bit of a change too, and I've read with interest is around the new Act and regulating waste as an essential service. And I love that because obviously we see what we do and the sector as an essential service, and it becomes very clear it's an essential service when you can't recycle or you need to do something. So I think, can you tell us a bit more about the reason for setting up the Act and how that's going to play out? You foresee that?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously that's sort of one of the things that's in its somewhat in its infancy, and it was great to see the Act, and indeed a waste authority that will ultimately deliver parts of that Act being flagged in the policy. And certainly that, the work around the Act and setting up the provisions will take some time, that will ultimately sort of lead to some sort of consultation and impact assessment. And that work will probably take, a lot of work over the next 12 to 18 months. But I think the intention is pretty clear. I mean, essentially, we've got parts of the sector, as we've spoken about, that aren't necessarily functioning as well as they could be, and government hasn't, the Victorian government has an appetite to, I think, have more levers to use to essentially look to rectify those issues. And equally, from a governance point of view, which is the other signal in there, I think there's a lot of moving parts. The roles and responsibilities in the sector, particularly across the public service, aren't always clear, and indeed the sort of interplay between state government and local government equally. And I think the Waste Act really is an opportunity to bring a really focused piece of legislation together that ties neatly, that knits neatly those parts together. And then equally, I think a waste authority, regardless of what that looks like and what its powers are, again, sort of supporting that more integrated delivery model across waste and resource recovery. And I think that's if you look at the way it's sort of diffused at the moment over multiple acts, there's roles and responsibilities in the Environment Protection Act, roles and responsibilities in the Local Government Act, the Sustainability Victoria Act. There's a whole raft of sort of provisions and mechanisms, and I think the opportunity to bring that together in a more cohesive picture is clearly a good one, and it's great to see that flagged in the policy. But again, good to reiterate that that's probably one that'll take a little while just to roll out.
and probably the thing that one of the key components of that is having it regulated as an essential service. Do you think that'll get up? Do you think it'll get defined as an essential service?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball. I mean, I would certainly think so. The government clearly has an appetite for waste as an essential service, and again, that was flagged early in the Recycling Industry Strategic Plan about talking with the Essential Services Commission about what some of the additional or new provisions might be. So there's no doubt that the government appetite is there. I think the question is, what exactly does that look like? What are those provisions, and how far do they go? And again, I think the government's been pretty clear that it wants to look at a whole range of options and a whole range of different models, from those that are light touch all the way down to those that are less light touch. Yeah. So it's going to be an interesting journey over the next sort of 12 to 18 months.
Yes, but currently you're doing the implementation of Recycling Victoria and starting that process. So talking about interesting models, the 4-bin system. So purple bins, you've got the full colour set, and the introduction of the fourth bin, the glass bin, has certainly captured a lot of interest from around Australia. What's the rationale behind introducing another bin? How's that come to be?
Yeah, it was obviously a journey and a really important one. And I think one of the fundamental, the biggest shifts in the policy is this idea of curbside reform. And comically, I recall some of the early consultation work that Infrastructure Victoria did for their piece of work for VicGov. And the Herald Sun got hold of the early report and suggested 6 or 8 or 10 bins or something ridiculous like that. So we had a bit of a joke internally that we're going to end up with 36 bins just to give the Herald Sun a bit of a rub. But look, ultimately this comes from a lot of feedback from the industry. And again, I think this idea of the quality of material going in, particularly to MRFs, is equal and opposite to the material going out. You cannot expect a wonderful unicorn of a piece of infrastructure to suddenly and magically disaggregate a whole range of materials of varying types and values and quantities, and do that in a perfect way. So whatever interventions we can make to both support community, the Victorians, in getting access to the best services, and equally making sure that we've got a market that's able to respond and able to cope with those services, I think is the fundamental driver for that. And we heard throughout the consultation for Recycling Victoria this idea that glass can be somewhat pervasive through our curbside recyclables stream. And we all know the potential impacts of that in terms of its ability to perhaps reduce the commodity values of paper and cardboard and plastics, and equally the challenges of getting particularly broken glass both out of the MRF system and then equally into some form where it can be used as an end commodity. So I think all of those drivers really prompted government to have a look at just what the benefits and weaknesses would be of looking at a new model. And that was followed by some fairly rigorous consultation with councils and industry. And ultimately, it stacked up. It stacked up both in terms of the costs and benefits, and equally in terms of the very clear messages we were getting from the industry about wanting cleaner, better aggregated streams to deal with. So I think the origins are clear, but it's also, I think, Mark, important to note that the curbside reform isn't just about an extra service for glass. That's certainly a part of it. But the other part of it is about a more sort of statewide approach to rolling out combined food and garden organics collections, because again, we recognise that both industry and community has a very high appetite to be recovering more food waste in particular. So those things together are sort of what we broadly, as well as, sorry, the other part, Mark, is about this idea of consistency. Again, we know that across our 79 councils, there are multiple models with multiple different types of bin sizes and colours and messages and symbols. And I think that idea of consistency, again, very much came through through the discussion paper and the consultation. And Victorians want a system that broadly looks and feels the same, whether they're, in Dimboola, or whether they're in Mooroolbark, or whether they're on holiday down in the Mornington Peninsula. So they're sort of the three fundamentals of that reform.
Yeah, you touched on the food waste. The food and garden organics is obviously being another key platform for this curbside reform, and that fundamentally needs to be linked with processing and then market demand for those products. How do you see that sort of playing out? And is the processing available and the market demand available? Or do you see that sort of working together as these things come online over a period of time? And before I let you answer, the most important part is, well, not the most important part, the frequency of that FOGO collection. What's sort of the thinking and at the moment on that?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'll try and get there pretty quickly. Yeah. But look, I mean, firstly, I'll say that the move around FOGO is obviously one part of our approach around food waste, recognising that firstly and foremost, there needs to be a consistent and sustained approach around waste reduction, food waste reduction in particular, and that's a fundamental part of things like the Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre and the Low Waste Living campaign as part of the policy. So I'll say that up front. In terms of the market development and industry development aspect, you're absolutely right, and I think it's good that the policy gives a fair lead in time. So there's no expectation that suddenly, as of tomorrow, 2.2 million households are suddenly rolling out a FOGO system. This is about working closely with councils. It's about working closely with the industry around how we put those tenders out to market. There's certainly capacity in some of the current infrastructure we have, like the Sakir facility in Dandenong and the Veolia facility in Bulla. But you're absolutely right. Ultimately, there will need to be new investment in infrastructure, and ultimately a lot of work around market development. And that's work, that we're not starting from afresh with. We've done a lot of work in market development around organics, particularly sort of in that period from about 2011 to 2015. After we had the first sort of stage of issues in the organics market in Victoria. And I think there's certainly scope to expand that and reboot some of those areas, certainly around broadacre agriculture and making sure we've got better links directly into that part of the food system. And again, that complementary part about making sure that households are using those systems appropriately, so the material going into organics processing facilities is as clean as it can be, and that way we can get good, high quality material at the back end that has high demand. And I think, Mark, having been to South Australia and done a number of tours around there, one thanks to your fine self, it's great to see that the fact that that there are states and territories getting to that point where it's actually demand that's exceeding supply, and that's a wonderful place to be. And I think with our agricultural culture sector in Victoria, that's equally a place that we can reach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, and in terms of the frequency, good question. I mean, again, I think the point about the curbside reform is that whilst the state has absolutely a view of rolling out a reform agenda, of rolling out a 4-service system for Victoria, it's really important to note that comes with a caveat that councils need to have flexibility to design a service that suits them. It's unlikely that the same system that I get in the greater Melbourne area, which you would imagine would be, 4 bins, is going to be the same as somebody in Hopetoun or somebody that lives 20 k's out of Yakandanda. It's likely that will be a slightly different system, but certainly the broad overall model, assumes that The stinky stuff, the food and garden organics, would likely be a weekly collection, augmented by fortnightly residual and commingled recycling, alternating, and probably a monthly glass service. But I have to stress that is the model on which the assumptions have been based. That is not necessarily the model that all councils will roll out. And we've seen obviously a lot of engagement with the community in those councils that have gone already to a glass service or a FOGO service, and making sure things like nappies and those things that are really important to young families in particular, that there's options for those households. So I think that's a really important point to state.
Yeah, great. Now I'm conscious of that we're starting to run through our time here, Matt. We could talk for hours on
like
this.
A wind-up toy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing a couple of questions come through on container deposit. Just before I jump onto that, waste to energy is something that potentially feeds into curbside and also into the C&I sector. Any quick comments on that before we jump into CDS, and we can answer a couple of the questions that are coming through on CDS?
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, you're right. There's a couple of things there around that sort of curbside reform. I think the complementary one there that we have to talk about, because you can't talk about waste to energy and certainly thermal waste to energy in isolation, is sort of this idea of collaborative procurement. And again, I certainly see that as a pillar of the Victorian system moving forward. Putting good volumes out to market to allow the industry to compete is essential. And then equally, there's no doubt that within that, particularly from the point of view of residual waste, that those companies may have an appetite for waste to energy as an alternative to landfill. And it's great to see the policy put some signals in there about government's intent around there. But equally, and I'll preempt your next question, Mark, I'll answer it for you, right. is that certainly the government wants to make sure that in releasing a policy, in releasing a signal about waste to energy, that this idea of materials recycling must always take precedent. It must always be at the forefront. It must always be the priority. And as a result, the government signalled its intent to look at provisions around setting a cap on thermal waste to energy of 1 million tonnes per annum. And that is something, again, that as part of the design around things like the Waste Act and the Waste Authority, the government will be looking at in terms of what mechanisms it uses for that.
Very good, thank you. CDS, so Victoria's introducing a CDS, so we've got a couple of questions. Yay, well done, welcome. Welcome. So there's a couple of questions here about just keen to hear about the CDS system and how it might roll out. But one of the questions, particularly from Tim Cummings, is around what's the thinking around the commencement of the fourth bin before the CDS is implemented. So yeah, you don't necessarily get to see the impact on the glass on that bin before it's implemented. But there may be some comments on the CDS in general, and then also that impact on the glass bin.
Sure.
CDS.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is wonderful to see the government finally announce its move to introduce a container deposit scheme. So that's good news for all of us. And again, I think it all dovetails in very neatly to this idea of cleaner streams, higher commodity values, more resilient sector, and it's a great signal to be sending. And certainly, whilst some might argue Victoria's late to the party, I think this government in particular has been unashamed at its intent to watch what happens in the other states. It's a big policy shift. It's not something that the government wanted to enter into lightly. And so it's made the signal now after having a look at how it's rolling out in the other states and territories. And I think that gives us ultimate opportunity to design the best model, the one that takes the good parts from what we've already seen rolling out, and making sure that there's a fair, equitable system that works. And so that'll be again rolling out over the next few years in terms of the design of that work. So unfortunately, I can't answer any questions about whether wine bottles are in or out, or whether it's going to be 15 cents or 20 cents. I think all of those things will need to come into the design, and there'll be extensive consultation in the development of the CDS and its ultimate rollout. So in terms of the kind of interplay between the two, it's a very, very difficult nut to crack. And I think the good thing about the policy is it clearly sends a signal on both. So whilst you could argue that the reforms should go first and the CDS second, or others may argue that the CDS should go first or the curbside reforms go second, in a world like ours with 79 councils that have different contract start and end dates, we just simply don't have that luxury. Essentially, the two are going to have to roll out side by side. And I think the important part is that the signal has been sent early so that the planning can happen both in terms of councils and how they roll out their the curbside service for glass, equally the processes and how they're looking at investing in the future, and then equally those that are interested in being a part of the CDS proper, in terms of vending machines or glass processing or plastics recovery, etc., etc. So I think to some extent that's going to play out how it plays out, and our commitment has always been to give clear and transparent signals as and when we can, and so I think the design and development of the CDS will be done with the curbside system in mind, and vice versa. But certainly, I think the argument there is that whilst the CDS will do wonderful things at capturing particularly those materials that are likely to find their way into the litter stream or the public place recycling stream, it may not. It won't recover all of the glass from households. We know that for a fact. We know that in terms of the recovery rates for other CDS schemes, both in Australia and internationally. So the idea of having a system that can still be augmented and make sure that things like glass jars and those households that perhaps are less inclined to use a CDS for their household waste, that glass still has a really clear pathway to a future productive end use.
Fantastic. Now we've got a range of questions coming in here, Matt, and I am seeing that we're sort of getting towards the time, so I'm going to try to punch through a few of these and see if we can do them reasonably quickly. Good luck with this.
All right.
So that
if you ask me easy questions, I'll give you easy answers.
Yeah, I won't ask easy questions because none of these are easy questions. So we have a question from Stella. Could you discuss how the 4-bin system is going to be adapted to existing apartment buildings where bin rooms have not been designed to accommodate for the number of bins, etc.? So how could that work?
Yeah, extremely good question. And again, I think it goes back to that point I said before about there is no one-size-fits-all approach here. So whilst government's very clear that it has an agenda that the system looks like the one we've laid out in the policy, there's a lot of work with both councils and private operators on making sure that we can find systems that support multi-unit dwellings or MUDs, which are becoming a large part of the housing mix in Victoria and indeed globally. So there's some work that needs to be done there, both in terms of updating, I think, the best practice guidance for multi-unit dwellings, and that's something we're looking at the moment, and equally working with commercial and commercial operators in terms of the design of systems. And it could be things like, for instance, upgrades and retrofits to common waste areas in a block of flats or a high-rise dwelling, rather than necessarily trying to retrofit a third or fourth chute into a building that's already been developed that would clearly not be cost-effective to do it. So I know that's a somewhat ambiguous answer, but if you can think of the variability in the types of MUDs we have, there certainly is no one-size-fits-all. All I can say is that we absolutely are committed to working with those councils and those dwellings to make sure they have a system that suits them.
Yeah, great. One here from Alex Sebo. Hi, Alex. Matt, great presentation. Yes, it is, Matt. Will the cap on energy recovery include contaminated biosolids? From Alex.
Yeah, look, that's probably a level of detail, Alex, that we're not at the moment. Again, I think there's plenty of work to do from government's point of view to design the mechanism and work through all those machinations about what's in and what's out of the cap. So that's a question I can't answer at this stage.
No problems. Dan Crawford asked for method recycling. What education, auditing, and support will be initially provided to help the transition across to the 4-bin system? A huge factor in reducing contamination and ensuring success. And one thing that we probably haven't touched on is all those supports and grants and programs that are going to be a part of this. So.
Yeah, and I should do better at weaving that in, given that's pretty much SV's bread and butter. So thank you, Mark and Dorothy Dixer, for the great question. No, I'm just kidding. Look, certainly. So the curbside reforms come with a comprehensive funding package. I think what's been announced is in the ballpark of about $100 million, and that will be used to support councils in many, many ways in terms of support for additional costs for additional bins, for instance. Certainly, there's a significant amount of funding, both for a statewide behaviour change campaign that supports the rollout of the system, and equally funding to support councils to then customise that behaviour change campaign and roll that out to their residents. So there is a comprehensive package that's part of the policy announcement that I encourage you to have a look at, and there's absolutely no doubt that government has a really clear commitment to work with councils that want to come along for this journey and support them with funding and behaviour change campaigns to make sure that we're rolling this out in a consistent, fair, equitable way that doesn't disadvantage councils.
Very good, thank you. I am seeing we're sort of getting to the end of time. We've still got a few questions, Matt. We've got time for a couple more. Is there any there, Matt, that you like the look of?
I'm not looking at the questions, mate. I'm just letting you do your job.
Yeah, that's my job. That's my job.
As
yeah,
moderator.
I know that's meant to be my job. I'm not the fastest reader either. So I'm just thinking. So there's another question on high density and being able to deal with the recycling problems in high density areas. So I think similar to what we've talked about before.
There's a question here, Mark, about consumers. So why don't I answer the question that's in front of me whilst you're backpedaling to try and find another good question. So there's a good question by Carlos, really about essentially fruit and veggies and being in plastic packaging and consumer packaging more broadly, and that's a really good question. And it was one that came up many times in sort of the deliberations around the policy. So there's a couple of things there. Certainly additional work with the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, APCO, and it's great to see all states and territories sign up to those packaging targets, which I think will make a big impact. Certainly the government in Recycling Victoria has flagged its intent to look at single-use plastics. So obviously the plastic bag ban is one of those mechanisms, and there's a commitment in Recycling Victoria to look at other single-use plastic items. But certainly there's complexity around there with food waste. There always has been, there always will be. That sort of interplay between a plastic wrapping that can make a food product last 30, 40, 50% longer, and what are the strengths and weaknesses or benefits and of those sorts of decisions. But certainly it's really part of the policy considerations. And the other thing there is around the Business Innovation Centre, the Circular Economy Business Innovation Centre, which is really about looking at developing partnerships to look at low waste living, waste reduction, food waste, a whole range of activities. And I think that's a really exciting part of the policy that kind of has a tendency to get missed amongst all the sort of talk about recycling reform. So I hope that's answered your question, Carlos.
Great, Matt. I'm gonna say that's it for now, and I'd like to thank you very, very much. So what I've heard today is that this is a significant reform agenda that's over a long period of time, and it really is going to transform sort of Victoria's recycling sector over this next period of time. The other takeaway I've got is it's not something you're looking to do overnight. You're looking at a staged sort of measured approach. There's a few things that are going to be occurring in a complementary sort of time frame with each other. The targets are strong and ambitious, with a sort of an 80% sort of total recycling rate at the end, reading the document, and a 50% organics recovery rate, which is certainly the best in the country at the moment. So I think it sort of stands well for Victoria. There is a few more questions that are coming through. We'll need to leave those. They are all good questions and relevant. I'm sure Matt would be happy to answer some of them directly if you wanted to pose them to him. Matt, I'd really like to thank you. This is very generous of you to be able to share this, and from Sustainability Victoria to thank them as well for having you being able to talk to us all. Thank the audience. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you've got something out of it. And just in final sort of wrap up, again, thank you, Matt. We're planning to do another webinar. Matt, I just wanted, before I talk about the next webinar, is anything that you'd like to finalise? Any final comments from you? You're happy?
Look, other than just say thanks, Mark, and thanks to everyone for listening. I'm always happy to talk about this sector. It's a great sector, and I said before, I think it's got infinite potential, and we're certainly at Sustainability Victoria very invested in seeing it reach that potential. So thanks as always for having us.
Yeah, pleasure, Matt. So yeah, next webinar is on the 30th of April for us, and we're going to be talking about circular textiles with guest speaker Shani Wood. Shani's done a global study on textiles, and she's going to be able to share some of those findings from that. So have a look at that if you're interested in the world of textiles, an interesting space. So it was quite often an overlooked space in our sector. But a really fundamental part of managing resources effectively. So thanks again, Matt. Thanks all for joining us, and I hope you got something from it. And yeah, keep safe and keep healthy. We'll be through it together, back at a conference together before we know it.
Let's hope so.
Speak well.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.